Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture in our annual lecture series titled COVID-19 Governance and Impacts, China from Comparative Perspectives. My name is Qin Gao. I'm a faculty member at the Columbia Weatherhead East Asian Institute and also the director of the China Center for Social Policy at Columbia, the two organizations, two institutes that host today's lecture. Today's lecture is also part of the Andrew J. Nathan Taiwan lecture series, actually the first lecture in this amazing new lecture series. So now I have the great honor to introduce my colleague, Dr. Andrew Nathan, class of 1919 professor of political science at Columbia, to speak about this new lecture series. Andy.
Thank you. Thank you, Chin. I just want to take note that this is the first of a series that we're calling the Andrew J. Nathan Taiwan Lecture Series. I'm very, very honored that it's in my name. A friend of the Institute named Frank Wang in Taiwan, when we were visiting there about a year ago, showed so much enthusiasm for raising funds for promoting Taiwan studies at Columbia, and he got 24 other people along with himself to donate funding for an endowment so that we could have a series of lectures on Taiwan always. And this is the first in that series, and we have some great things coming up in this series. In fact, this week on Wednesday afternoon at 4, we have the second lecture in this series, which is a novelist from Taiwan named Yang Shuangzi and her translator, Lin King, to talk about a prize-winning novel that Yang Shuangzi wrote that's very fascinating. We'll have that meeting in this room. And we have great plans for all kinds of other interesting events in the series. So I just wanted to, I don't know if Frank or any of his friends who donated funding for this series are listening or might see this recorded, but I want to thank them. And we're very excited, and it's great that this is the first event, because this is a very interesting one that demonstrates the value of this whole project. So thank you, Chin, for letting me say a few words, and let's go to your topic.
Thank you so much, Andy, and thank you everyone for coming here to join this first lecture in the series, and thanks to our funders for the lecture today. So today's lecture is part of this COVID lecture series, which is also supported by the Henry Luce Foundation. We want to document history and carry out analysis before it's too late. Today's lecture will be given by Dr. Wei-Ting Yen. Dr. Yen is an assistant research fellow at the Institute of Political Science at Academia Sinica in Taiwan. Her research focuses on democratic governance, comparative political economy, and the welfare state in Asia. Today, his talk will focus on how South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, three developmental states, adopted distinct medical resource strategies during the early phase of COVID-19. We will start with the lecture and save the questions for later. For those of you who are online, please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A box, and we will turn back to your question later on. Thank you.
For Professor Cao. Professor Cao.
Oh, she's in the event.
Oh yeah, there's someone that is downstairs looking for her, and she doesn't have the access to the
Instructed.
Yeah, she's gonna come up. I'm not sure.
Wait,
I'm just
she's on the fixed floor or
no, on the floors.
Okay. Hold this. Okay, so you all can hear me? All right, well, thank you very much for being here. First, I want to give my true appreciation to Gaoxing for inviting me to be part of the annual lecture series. And I have actually as a student of social policy, I've known of Columbia School, like China Center for Social Policy, for quite a few years. So it's really an honor to be able to find a way to be involved in it. And I also feel deeply honored that I just learned that I'm the first of the Andrew Nathan Taiwan Studies series. So this is simply double the level of honor I feel right now. And last but not least, I think it's quite exciting for me to have the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on COVID governance. And I know some of you are probably also thinking about relevant related topics. So I feel excited to be able to share some of my thoughts with you, given that I've spent a lot of time thinking about COVID governance in the last couple of years. So the project I'm presenting today is called Leveraging Coordination Capacity, Medical Resource Mobilization in Asia's Developmental State during COVID-19. And so I have been working on COVID governance, especially the political economy aspect of COVID-19, and in the past couple of years. And the project I'm presenting today is the last piece of a series of paper I've been published. And so this just got published earlier in May this year. And so what motivated this project, to talk about the motivation of this project, I have to go back to 5 years ago when COVID first started happening. I know it sounds like a million years ago, but it literally was about 5 years ago. And so if you still remember, bring you back to that time, when COVID first hit, it created huge disruption to the global supply chain. So for a little while, especially in the early, in the midst of 2020, all the countries had to find a way to tackle shortage problem. And the shortage problem can be from food to electronics, like refrigerator. So at the time, I just moved to my new place. I had a hard time trying to purchase some of the home appliance because of the shortage problem. And the shortage problem also appear in medical resources. And so if we just zoom in specifically on PPE, on medical supplies, before COVID-19, the world actually imported about 50% of its PPE from China. And if we look solely on masks, the world China basically exported 60% of the surgical masks to the world before the pandemic started. So as you can imagine, when the supply chain got shut down, nobody's getting masks, what happens? And so at the time, I observed government. So if you think about COVID like an exogenous shock, it's like a shock to every government, and all the nation states have to find their strategy, and they have different strategy in how they cope with the situation. And so when I was observing how they responded, in the case of mask, I already observed there are different ways of how the government approach it. And here I'm giving you just some examples so you remember what happened then. So Germany and India, for example, very quickly impose an export control, impose an export restriction. So you cannot just simply export masks to other countries. But at the same time, Thailand and the United States adopted a very different approach. I don't know if you remember, but when COVID first started, because there was no mask, so the government for a while advocate alternative masks, which is cloth masks, right? And we all know afterward that it's not really useful. But that was a strategy. The government was trying to convince people, like, here are the alternative approaches. And we also saw other types of reactions. Singapore, for example, in my opinion, is one of the best response. The Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, at the time, came out January 2020, outright downplay the importance of masks and basically telling people that if you're not sick, do not wear a mask. And that kind of partially contributed to the Singapore's first outbreak in April 2020. And so after April, he kind of had a U-turn on what the importance of masks. And Taiwan, on the other hand, we saw, if you're familiar with Taiwan's story, Taiwan's COVID story is basically a mask story. So it not only imposed export control, centralized distribution, what makes Taiwan's case very distinctive from the rest of a lot of other cases is its ability to actually mobilize, produce tons of masks to a point that there is oversupply of masks that Taiwan can do mass diplomacy. But when I look at Taiwan's success story in mask, at the time, I was also comparing like cross-sectoral variation. And I noticed that even though Taiwan did a very good story, has a very successful national mass story, it's not necessarily that good in other type of resources, medical resource, for example, testing kit and vaccine. Taiwan tried to create some vaccine, but relatively speaking, it's not that successful. And so I kind of took this cross-sectoral variation within country cross-sectoral variation, and then I kind of zoom out a little bit, and then I did a bit of cross-case, cross-national comparison, and I realized there's a lot of variation. And I look at Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore at the time, and I found that, well, these are three very famous developmental states, and they are all very high capacity states. And I did see that they all try to mobilize resources the way they can, but I also noticed that just the three cases, there are different variations in terms of what they're able to successfully mobilize. So that kind of paves the foundation for the research question I am trying to solve in this paper. So it's basically in this paper, I was trying to explain to give answers to two questions. The first is, why were developmental states better than a lot of other types of political economy in expanding their medical resources capacities amidst the supply chain crisis? So that was my first question. The second question then is, all right, then, but they're all able to mobilize resources, but there is variation. So what explains the variation in the types of medical resources mobilized by South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore? So that's the talk. Hopefully, I'm going to tell you the answer, and I'm interested to know if you find the answer convincing or not. But before I scaffolding the argument, I just want to give you a preview of where I'm going. And okay, so the argument I'm trying to advance in this talk is, I want to argue that in order to understand whether a nation state has the capacity to mobilize resources and what type of medical resources they can successfully mobilize, we have to trace back to a state's industry level coordination capacity prior to the crisis. So basically, I'm trying to argue that the state's existing coordination capacity before the crisis is going to determine its resource mobilization capacity during the crisis. And I argue in this paper that I think overall the developmental states are better equipped for coordination, to solving some coordination challenges during the crisis than other political economies, because they have had a lot of prior experience in doing coordination, in overcoming coordination challenge in the process of trying to do economic catch-up since the end of World War II. And then the second part I'm arguing is that, but if we're talking about coordination strength, we have to look at the industry level, because the coordination strength of each developmental state actually differs due to its past dependency. So even though all the three economies are considered as successful examples of developmental states, their political economy structure is very different. Korea is very chaebol oriented. Taiwan is very SME, small medium enterprises oriented, and Singapore is very international market oriented. And I think that set up a path dependency that can explain what kind of medical resource can be successfully mobilized during the crisis. So this is the preview of my argument. I hope I will convince you. And so for me, what I personally consider probably the most unique aspect of this paper is that I try to combine the developmental state literature and the crisis management literature. I'm not developing anything conceptually new. I'm more like just looking at different literature, and I think what is happening can be best explained if we bring them together. And so crisis management literature scholars have long studied crisis and how we can successfully govern a crisis. And so for this group of people, they highly focus on this idea called coordinated mobilization. So they basically think to have a more successful crisis governance experience, the government needs to be able to have coordinated mobilization. And what it basically says is that in order to, in a crisis, in order to get a resource to places where you need, you basically need to complete 3 steps. First, you have to identify if you have the resources and where the resources are, right? And the second part is you have to identify the key personnel, like who are the people who can help you to actually mobilize the resources. And the third is to match them together. So have the key personnel matching with the resource you want to mobilize and deploy. The crisis management literature has long argued that coordination is actually harder than mobilization. You may have the resources there, but whether you are able to actually coordinate to mobilize them, that's a different question. And for crisis management literature, coordination is harder than the mobilization itself. Why? Because there are a couple of challenges that can easily arise, even in normal times. I'll give you some examples. Like principal agent problem is a classic potential problem that can arise in trying to arrange coordination. For example, in the US, when first COVID happened, President Trump actually wanted 3M to stop exporting masks and to lower price to oversupply. But 3M didn't want to do that because their interests do not align. So the government may ask the private business or local agent to do something, but the local agents or business may have different interests and that just disalign with the government. So in the case of the United States at the time, 3M was already exporting a lot of masks to other countries. And so for them, in order to maximize profit, that makes more sense for them to continue with their business strategy and exporting all the masks to other places. And so in the end, Trump had to invoke what is that? Defense Production Act, which is basically an act that was done after that was put in law after Korean War to use kind of a wartime act to force private sector to comply. But that's an example of principal agent problem. And there are other type of problems like collective action problem as well, because sometimes when you're trying to coordinate, you need everybody to do exactly the same thing. But sometimes free riding may be the best choice for different business, depending on the situation. But even when we're talking about just compliance behavior in COVID, like vaccine compliance, people individually may feel like, oh, I don't want to do that, so they want to free ride the situation, but the assumption is that everybody is doing it, so I can benefit from everybody getting vaccination and me not getting it. So that's another potential problem that can arise when you're trying to coordinate. And the third problem is information, and this is a particularly acute kind of situation when it's in a crisis, because when you're trying to coordinate, you actually are trying to communicate sometimes across jurisdiction or sometimes across sectors. And so having information flow and communication can reduce the transaction cost. And sometimes it can be very difficult when you're not familiar who your counterpart is. And so those are the 3 challenges. There are more, but like these are the 3 major challenges that can happen in coordination. And this can already happen in normal times. Crisis just make it even worse. Why? Because in a crisis situation, first, usually when crisis happens, it means that it also equipped with a high level of uncertainty. Right? So it's a very uncertain time. And the second kind of feature of all the crisis management is that crisis management is like a race against time, because usually better response is quicker response. And so when you have time constraint and high level of uncertainty and you're trying to coordinate, solve, like overcome all the challenges, it just becoming an even more, it makes it even more challenging when you're trying to do coordination in crisis. And so that's kind of how the crisis management literature people talks about coordination. And so what I am trying to argue in the first part that I'm trying to argue in this paper is basically that I am arguing that I think developmental state in Asia has a strong advantage when it comes to resource coordination for production in crisis. And the reason why it has a better, stronger advantage in doing so is because it already had a lot of coordination experiences in trying to achieve industrial upgrading. So basically, since World War II, governments, the traditional what we call like successful example of developmental states, they are already being having more and more experience in coordinating in order to help catching up economically speaking. And so the developmental state literature people have like long talk about what are the coordination challenges that can arise in the industrial upgrading process. So very quickly, I here summarize 3 things that I think the developmental state governments are really good at doing. So they're really good at solving coordination problem at 3 levels when trying to pursue economic development, especially industrial upgrading. The first is coordination within industry. So when you are trying to have industrial upgrading, say for example, from labor-intensive economy sectors to more knowledge-intensive sector, that transition has to happen with all the upstream upstream business all the way to downstream part of the sector. The sector itself has to basically be upgrading together for the upgrading to happen successfully. You cannot just have one part upgrading and the rest is still labor intensive. Then that will fail basically that will fail industrial upgrading. So that's the first coordination challenge the developmental state faced in trying to catch up economically. The second coordination challenge they often have to help overcome is to find money. So basically, when you're trying to do industrial upgrading, all the business needs new investment. They need money. Where's the money coming from? For the bank, if you're just purely operating in the market economy, the bank usually want to only invest in things or industry that they feel like they're going to get a return. And so sometimes it may not be that easy to channel the fund to the correct industry that the government wants. And so the second kind of coordination a lot of developmental state government did was to basically help channeling that fund, like to coordinate between bank and industry for industrial development. And the third coordination that we usually see with the developmental state is that coordinating research and development, basically coordinating R&D. So for a lot of industrial upgrading, and if you're thinking about industry, I can easily give you an example, like the semiconductor industry basically embodies all the 3 coordination problem. So in that case, when you are trying to do industrial upgrading, there's a lot of upfront research and development cost. And if you just leave it to each individual companies or industry, they may not have the incentive to actually do that, because if they're just looking at things in a short run, it's not necessarily matching with their short-term interest. And so the third thing that we usually see the developmental state do is to help coordinate the R&D. So they may set up some public research institute and help with the technology transfer to help boost the R&D part of the industrial upgrading. And so those are the 3 things prior to the crisis that I think the developmental states are already good at doing to help industrial development. So they're already tackling, so in all 3 places story of economic development, the government was basically all trying to solve the coordination challenge that appear in the process and to help minimize the economic risk private business sectors would have to bear. So that was their role prior to the crisis. And so following that kind of line of literature, the next point I am arguing basically is that pre-crisis coordination experience actually offer the developmental states some extra advantage during a crisis. Here I have two things I say. One is that before the crisis, they already had repeated interactions. So if the government is trying to invest in this industry, they already had prior repeated interaction with that industry. So what does that bring? It means a couple of things. One, they already know each other. They already have the kind of network and connections established prior to the crisis. It help foster mutual trust. You're not just dealing with a brand new person when the crisis hit. You're dealing with someone you already know, that you may already have interaction with, that it actually can foster mutual trust and with interests more aligned. And because of repeated interaction prior to the crisis, it also served as a good monitoring mechanism to help to achieve higher compliance by the business, because this is a repeated game theory, basically. Like, there is a repeated game. There's a next round of game. If I don't comply this time, the government may try to pull something out, like from pull some resources out. And so it actually helped lower the free riding behavior, in my opinion, and foster that mutual trust. And the second thing I think that's beneficial in a crisis situation is that because those developmental states, they already had those coordination experience, they had communication channels established already. So they're not like building completely new communication channel. And if you still remember, I said earlier, like, coordination can be hard, and it can be even harder in crisis because information environment usually is more chaotic when a crisis hit. Nobody knows where the things are, who I should talk to in order to do what. And it's a race against time. So if you already have those existing communication channels, it actually reduce the risk of miscommunication or lack of communication. And in many cases, actually all the cases, it also it creates the communication loop that the government can easily know what's the part that's not working, and then put resources in the right place in order to make resource mobilization happening. So this, in my opinion, are the advantage of the developmental state model when it comes to resource mobilization during crisis. And so just to very quickly summarize again what I think matters in crisis governance, especially in mobilization of resources, I am trying to argue that the state's coordination capacity is very crucial in crisis management. And the developmental state model have a significant coordination capacity because of their prior experiences. And that can be useful for essential medical resources mobilization during crisis. But I'm also very aware that when I say developmental state, I treat them like they're the same thing, but they're not. And so the second part of this paper tries to argue that if we're looking at developmental state at their coordination strength, and if you look at it cross-sectorally, you will know that they all have different coordination strength depending on their industrialization path. And I think a medical resource can only be successfully mobilized if that resource is aligned with the coordination strength of that developmental state. So just because the developmental state has coordination capacity, it's going to mobilize everything. No, you have to, there's still some strength and weakness in terms of what they are better at coordinating. And those are the areas you're going to see more success. Okay. And so that's basically my argument. And before I present you the empirical results, I just want to very quickly throw out some alternative hypotheses as well. And so because when I was doing this, I was like, okay, let's figure out what are the other possible explanations. So when I evaluate my empirical evidence, I'm not just trying to, cherry picking, like this works for my argument, so I'm using this. So I'm evaluating everything all together to see also against the different alternative hypotheses to really try to get like what exactly the reality is and to what extent my argument can be applied to a broader context. And so the two alternative hypothesis I'm kind of testing as well is one is political will hypothesis. So in the pandemic, there is a line of research that basically argues that agency matters, right? Like, so political leadership matters. So competent leadership is very essential, which I completely agree with. But their logic basically is that whatever the government chooses to prioritize on resource-wise, that basically is the might of the political leader. So because they have the will in doing this, the government, the society is going to mobilize that risk. So that's a political will hypothesis. The second hypothesis is this past experience hypothesis, which you hear a lot, especially in the first part of COVID. So in Taiwan's case, for example, a lot of people will say Taiwan is successful because there was SARS. Korea is successful because it had MERS, because they had prior experience, so they're better equipped this time. And so basically the implied logic is that so for the past experience hypothesis to work, it basically suggests that whatever that was shortage in the past crisis is what the government will want to focus on this time. So in MERS, in Korea, because testing kit was inadequate in MERS, so that prompted the government to only focus on testing kit in Korea this time. So that's the past experience hypothesis. And so, like I said, I do the three developmental state cases, and I basically do a cross-case comparative analysis and within-case process tracing, and also cross-sectoral kind of analysis. And so I collect all the document, government published document between 2020 and 2022, and I supplement that with a few interviews to kind of make sure that I am not guessing, just like purely guessing. And the three cases I will talk about that later, in detail later, but the three cases are basically all developmental state model, but because of their political economy structure, coordination happens at different level. So in Korea, because it's very chaebol oriented, the coordination happens mostly at firm level. For Taiwan, because it's SME dominated, so the coordination happens more at an industry level, not at a firm level. Singapore, on the other hand, they have a very purposed capitalization, like capitalism, basically a very what's the way to do it? Deliberate capitalism. So they highly rely on multinational corporation and FDI, and hence the coordination happens exactly at the market level. And the three major medical resources I look at are the testing kit, masks, and vaccines. I can talk about why I choose them in the Q&A if there's an interest. Okay, so here is the overall empirical finding. I'll go through each of them later, but just to quickly give an idea what the empirical findings are. So basically, Korea that is featuring chaebols and big conglomerates where coordination happens at the firm level, they are also better at testing kit mobilization. And Taiwan is better at masks. Singapore, on the other hand, is really aggressive and very successful in their vaccine strategy. So moving forward, I'm going to just dive into the case a little bit. And for each case, I will start with their developmental state characteristic, and then to use that to explain why they're particularly good at this particular medical resource. And at the same time, I will also tell you why they're not as good in other areas. Okay, so are there questions up at this point before I dive into the empirical cases? Okay. So the first case is Korea. Korea, so like I said, its developmental state model is very chaebol oriented. And so like Samsung, LG, Hyundai, right? These are all the brand name that you know and can name off. And so when for a long time, when coordination happens in Korea, the government directly help, like Samsung, or LG at the firm level. And the government has a long tradition in basically helping with the R&D technology transfer and mapping the financial incentive and give them regulatory support. And prior to the crisis, the government Korea already has a food and a biotech sector because the government wanted. But after the Asian financial crisis, Chaebol has been criticized to be too big to fail. So after the Asian financial crisis, in order to develop the biotech industry, the Korean government basically created this like satellite model in which it starts supporting a lot of R&D focused startup companies in biotech sectors and have those startup companies do the frontier like R&D work, and the government kind of just help them through with regulatory support and some technology transfer. And once those whatever startup company became successful, then it got acquired by, say, Samsung. So Samsung basically outsourced its R&D work to some degree with the government together to those startups. But that's kind of how coordination happened already prior to the crisis. And it became a huge advantage during crisis. Why? Because the government basically rely on the same model. If we're talking about South Korea's COVID strategy, what's been most famous is the 3T model. They call it like testing, tracing, and treatment. The biotech kind of coordination strength really helped Korea to boost its testing capacity. So of the first part of the 3T model. And so when COVID happened, the government, because they already had those connections with the biotech industry, so late January, so I think it's like during Lunar New Year, the government basically convened a meeting with all the like biotech startup companies in Seoul train station, not even in the government agency because it's during Lunar New Year. It's just in the train station. This is real. Like there's report about this. And then the government basically say, we need testing kit. You figure it out. And then afterward, the government released the genetic sequencing to all those startups, and then promised them that they're going to relax the regulation so it's easier for them to apply for EUA, the emergency authorization, usage authorization. And so this was late January, and it pays off. I'm giving you some examples here. So the very first testing kit in Korea that got its EUA approval was February 4th. Which is when Korea only had 4 cases at the time. So you see how preemptive this strategy is. And in March 2020, when the WHO just declared this being a pandemic, 64 companies submit EUA authorization. And just to give you a perspective, how Korea is really good at doing this is in Taiwan, the very first EU testing kit, EUA, was authorized in June 2021, 15 months later than the Korea's first testing kit EUA. And that ability to pass so many testing kits so quickly also boost up its testing capacity because they basically have more testing kit they can use. So in Korea, they already were doing from 200 tests per day to 3,000 per day. And very quickly in April, they are able to conduct 20,000 tests like basically every day. And again, in comparison, in Singapore, because the resource was very limited, it all centralized. The government was only able to administrate about 3,000 tests per day in April 2020. Okay, so that was Korea's very success story in testing kit. However, when it comes to, if you evaluate the story of Korea, you will find that it actually have more issue with mask and with vaccine. With the mask story, it is a story that it is the story of no political will. So South Korea actually has capacity to build, like to basically ramp up mass supply if they want. They were producing about 2 million masks prior to the crisis per day, 2 million per day. But when it first started, the government, I think the government indeed, because of MERS, had the trauma experience that during MERS, testing kit was not enough. So there was a strong political will as well in trying to expand testing kit. But there was no political will in expanding mask production. It has the capacity, but there is no political will. And it eventually actually caused a shortage problem to a point that the president of South Korea at the time, Moon Jae-in, had to come out and apologize and then say, okay, the government is going to do something. And I think that was May or June 2020. And so then the government did go in to help, but still not the supply side. The government was basically working with the demands, like the distribution side, centralize the mask and then do rationing distribution for a little while. And the market kind of stabilized itself later in late 2020 when the market is more stabilized. So that was Korea's mask story. And its vaccine story is the opposite. The vaccine story is a story that the government has strong political will, but it doesn't have the capacity. And so, like I said, Korea's all those R&D happen at the startup level, so like small scale startup level. For the big conglomerate chaebols, they're good at manufacturing, but they're not good at, from phase 1 all the way to phase 3. And so Korea tried to develop its own vaccine, but I think it was Delta outbreak in 2021, because the outbreak just created another panic. So the government kind of in the process, because it was not quick enough, and other countries, Pfizer and Moderna already existed in early 2021. So they had to basically change their strategy and then instead sign a bunch of deals with AZ and Pfizer to say, okay, then we're going to be your licensed manufacturer. But they were originally trying to develop their vaccine. They just didn't have the capacity to make it work in a very short period of time. So that's the story of South Korea. And the story of Taiwan is the opposite. So like I said, you may all aware, Taiwan is really good at producing masks. And I think it has a lot to do with, when it happened, it makes a lot of sense. As a student of political economy, I was like, this makes a lot of sense. And I already bet that the government is not going to be very successful with vaccine when they started, because I knew from the get-go they don't have the resource to coordinate a successful response. And so Taiwan's developmental state feature has been very SME oriented, right? Like small, medium-sized enterprise dominated. The strength of that is that it's very flexible. It depends on what the customer need. They can immediately create a customer-oriented kind of a design team to help manufacture. And so there's a lot of our organizational flexibility in Taiwan's business model. And so prior to the crisis, the government already had a lot of, if you talk to people in Ministry of Economic Affairs, they will tell you that they already have line groups with the machine tool companies and with textile companies. And that's not just, their communications channel is not just with a company. It's like a whole group, like the industry. So machine tool companies, they all have a line group with the Minister of Economic Affairs at the time, Sun Rongjing. And so when COVID happened, that existing community channel became very useful resources, because the government basically formed the mass team also end of January 2020. And they convened a meeting, and the government said, we need masks. Go figure out how to produce masks. And in the process, in the beginning, well, there were a lot of challenges, but simply put, even though the government said you have to produce masks, it doesn't mean they can do that the next day. There's still some resource shortage. For example, they need to retool the machine. They need to have more machine physical cost to be covered. all of that was done in that line group, as far as I know. And so the communication cost is extremely low. And there were already prior interaction with each other. It just helped make sure that everybody is part of the team. And so it really, I have another paper writing all about the mask. So I'm going to, but if you're very interested, I recommend you to read that. But anyway, but for this talk, it really pays off because before the pandemic happened, Taiwan only was able to produce 1.8 million masks per day. South Korea was able to produce 2 million already prior to the crisis. Taiwan was only 1.8 million. But by May 2020, they're able to produce 20 million per day, like 20 million per day. So every day they are able to cover the whole island. And to a point that the oversupply situation becomes an advantage for Taiwan to initiate its mass diplomacy. So that's a very nice story. But the not so nice part of that story is that Taiwan was also trying very hard to actually develop everything. The testing story, okay, so Taiwan has political will to mobilize every resource because of the self-help mentality developed after SARS. And because Taiwan is excluded from the World Health Organization. So in the bureaucrats, it's very clear that Taiwan has no one to rely on. We have to rely on ourselves. So in the beginning of the crisis, there was a strong political will to actually develop testing kit and vaccine. So the national vaccine team was actually established at the same time when the national mask team, around the same time when the national mask team was formed. But the result is just not as good. So in the testing kit story, in both stories, it's like there is political will, but there's just not enough political capacity. If we give them 10 years, they're probably able to do so. When I say capacity, is that they just don't have the capacity to accomplish that task in such a short period of time. And so even though Taiwan did form a national testing kit, in the end, it still rely heavily, most of the testing kit from abroad, and actually mostly from Korea. And the vaccine story is exactly the same story. Like I said, it had the political will. And the national vaccine team was formed at the same time when the national mask team was formed. However, because Taiwan's SME-oriented structure, it has never been really good at biotech. So even if it's good, it's similar to the Korea story in that there will be some startup companies developing some drugs or let's say some drugs. They will pass a phase 1 trial. And then they will be acquired, be bought out by some, say, Moderna or Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson. In the case of Korea, it's bought out by Samsung or LG, but in Taiwan's case, they would just sell it to some international pharmaceutical companies. So Taiwan actually had never had any experience in commercializing a drug all the way from phase 1 to phase 3. And I don't know if you know this, phase 3 is usually the most costly phase. And so Taiwan did try to develop its own vaccine, and it does have a homegrown vaccine called Mellon. But when it applied for EUA, it was still in the phase 2 trial period. Whereas when Moderna and Pfizer applied for EUA sometime in late 2020, they were already in the process of trial 3 clinic. So it gives you an idea that just because you want to do it doesn't mean you can do it in a very short period of time. So that's the story of Taiwan. And the last story is the story of Singapore. So Singapore is, like I said, it's highly depending on the multinational corporation and FDI. So their strength really lies in coordinating with those multinational companies, not their homegrown companies, they're multinational company. And I don't know if you know, but they really had a strong presence in trying to develop biotech sector. And so all the major pharmaceutical companies have their Asia headquarters in Singapore, including Pfizer, including Moderna. And the agency helping nurture relationship with those multinational corporations is EDB, the Economic Development Board, which is basically the top mind of developmental state in in Singapore. So it's not their Ministry of Welfare, it's their Economic Development Board. And so Singapore very early on already had a very strong political will, like vaccine is the way out. So Lee Hsien Loong, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said multiple times that when there was no vaccine in the world, he basically was saying that only whoever gets vaccine will get out of this crisis sooner than other countries. And he embodies that thought. And so in Singapore's case, they don't have any domestic resources. So what their strategy was, they signed a bunch of MOU with all the international pharmaceutical companies. And when I say they sign, it's not Ministry of Welfare. It is a joint effort by the Economic Development Board and their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They go and sign more than 40 MOU with all the international pharmaceutical companies in May 2020. And the idea, if you still remember, May 2020, there was no vaccine available. So their strategy basically was like, I don't know which one of you will work, but whoever has the vaccine, we want to be the first batch of people getting vaccine. And that pays off. So Pfizer, so they also have a vaccine review board. So once Moderna and Pfizer pass, the EDB has a review board, not the welfare ministry. The EDB has a review board. And they pass and they say, okay, Pfizer. So Singapore was the first country after the US and UK and Israel, but Israel got it because they were the guinea pig for Pfizer to get vaccine. And I would say that strategy really pays off if we are looking at the vaccination rate by July 2021. So by July 2021, 70% of Singaporeans already got their first shot. And again, just to give you a comparison, like in South Korea, in that time, only 25% of population was vaccinated. Only 4% in Taiwan was vaccinated because there was not enough vaccine. Okay, so, and the story of Singapore, so like I said, the story of Singapore is the story of no natural homegrown resources. So it doesn't have resource to produce mask or testing kit. It has been relying on trade for the most part. And so in those two stories, what we're seeing is that it's a story in both areas. The story is there's no political capacity. And it's especially vivid in the mask situation because there was no political capacity to actually ramp up masks supply. But there was a changing political will. Remember at the beginning of the talk, I said Lee Hsien Loong outright downgrade the importance of masks for about 4 months until the first outbreak in April 2020. And then he changed his tone. He said, oh, actually, I think everyone should wear a mask. But if the political will hypothesis is correct, when you see the changing will, you should see the ramp up of resource, but we didn't see that. Singapore still did not have enough masks. And so Singapore went through, they call 2 months of circuit breaker, which is essentially a lockdown from April to June. And so that is a story of how political will in of itself doesn't really explain the whole story. Okay, so very quickly, thank you for bearing with me until this point. So very quickly to summarize the result. So basically the story I get by comparing different sectors across 3 developmental states is the following. 3 points I'm going to kind of like my result from this project is that, one, I do think that political will matters. So political will plays an equally important role in pandemic governance. But political will is just a necessary condition. In order to successfully mobilize resources, you have to have political will. But just by having political will itself is not going to guarantee you have a successful capacity to mobilize those resources. And case in point, vaccine story in Korea and Taiwan, and mask in Singapore. These are all areas where we see there is a political will, but it just doesn't yield the same mobilization result. So that's the first takeaway. The second takeaway, I think, is that I also evaluate, like I said, past pandemic experience. And I think past experience does matter. but I think it mostly affects political leaders' political will. It affects in the mind of political leader, like what I did wrong last time, so I need to work on this time. So it kind of still channels through the political will mechanism. And so they also have some other effects, but again, the cases I show you is that MERS, I think, did prompt Korea to try to focus on testing kids. So testing kids is an area there is strong political will and political capacity. But because there's no political will in masks, we don't see a successful mask story in Korea. In the case of Taiwan, like I said, SARS basically made Taiwan want to do everything on their own. The self-help mentality really explained a strong political will and that want to focus on all the resources. But again, as I show, it doesn't always lead to a successful mobilization outcome. So what this paper is trying to advance is to show that besides political will and political, like past pandemic experiences or past epidemic experiences, in order to fully understand whether a country can mobilize resources and what medical resource a country can expand its capacity on, I think it's very crucial to analyze it. You have to go back to the political economy structure. You have to analyze how different states embed themselves in the market prior to the pandemic, because that's going to tell you whether they have coordination strength, and if they do, in what industry they have coordination strength on, and that will help explain better how successful they can be in a crisis setting to mobilize specific medical resources. Okay, so I think that is, yes. So that concludes my talk. Thank you very much for your attention and listening. I appreciate any thoughts and feedback you have upon listening to this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We now open the floor up for our in-person and online audiences to raise any questions you have. If you're in person, please use a mic.
I have a two-sided question, which is on slide 19 on Taiwan and slide 22 on Singapore, you use a concept called political capacity. You say they have political will, but not political capacity.
Yes.
So what does that mean? And that's just a clarification question. But then what that made me think about is whether you really mean they don't have technical capacity or production capacity, whatever language you want to use. They just don't have that industry. And that led me to the following sort of challenge to your theory, which what if we took a very simple theory and said they just produced what they had the technical capacity to produce? So I know your research design is pretty nuanced, and so I think you probably had the answer to that challenge embedded in the research design, but what is your answer to that question? So if I just said, well, they wanted all three of these things, but they only had the capacity to produce one of them, so that's the one they did, that would be a very simple-minded sort of techno answer to the whole puzzle. So I wonder why that answer doesn't work.
So, okay, thank you. That's a great question. So I think when I say political capacity, what I think I mean is, I think it's okay. So I think it's corresponding to political will, but I think it's really policy capacity. Like, so you can say it's technical capacity, but like I think it's like how the capacity you are able to basically implement such a policy, and in this case, it's mobilizing resource policy. And so, so I actually agree with your second question. I think it is the story I'm trying to say. Like, yes, that's whatever they have capacity on is where they're going to have better results. But I think what I'm trying to say here is that we often look at, during COVID, we often look at the outcome and we say, oh, they're good at this because they're that. And then we look at, oh, they're good at that because they're, and so we sometimes think that, oh, by the way, an argument that's circulating a lot when COVID first started was people would say, oh, Asians are better at governing COVID because they're just more obedient. So they do whatever the government said. And I don't find that argument convincing at all. And so I think you may think okay, I agree with you actually. I think it's a very logical, straightforward way. And I saw this when COVID started happening. Like I had this argument in probably March 2020. But it still takes a paper to convince other people like that is the case in a very social scientific way. But you kind of summarize the whole talk in one sentence. It is the capacity story. And I think what I want to kind of make a point to other people who are not familiar with those cases, it's not because they want it, the government wanted it will work. But the government sometimes doesn't know what their strengths are. They may want everything. And this story is basically tell not just to people, but also the government, like you want to rely on what you are good at. And so I give you one more kind of follow-up story to this. So when Taiwan started this, they had, I was like, there's no way Taiwan's going to successfully develop its vaccine the way that how vaccination commercialization process happened. After the pandemic, and I've been always like, I think Taiwan's strength is in manufacturing. It's not actually in that kind of R&D and developing vaccine. And so I think the government realized that too during the pandemic. So at the time, the Vice President Chen Jianren, who is now back in Sinica, so he is a big person right now promoting this thing called TBMC. So not TSMC. It's called Taiwan Biotech Manufacturing Corporation. So basically, it's the same idea, but for producing vaccines. So the ability to manufacture vaccines, similar to Korea's model. And so I think they realized their weakness during pandemic governance. So now we're back to peacetime. They're really thinking about, okay, we need to ramp up that capacity right now when we still have time. And I think that is a lesson they learned from the pandemic.
Thank you so much. I think we need to close here. It's been a fascinating talk, and thank you all for participating, engaging in this conversation. Our next lecture in this series is on September 26th. It's a Friday at noon. It will feature Professor Ziying Yu from University of Georgia, who is a professor of literature and folklore studies, who interviewed many Chinese and Chinese American women during COVID. Fascinating stories to be heard. In November, we have a lecture on civic participation in China on COVID. So very much on this last question. And in January, we will have another Taiwan scholar who will talk about Taiwan in comparative context on COVID. So thank you all so much for coming. And thank you once again for our speaker, Dr. Wei-Ting Yen, for flying all the way to share your research with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.